Miriam jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she clutched the bedsheet tightly. The eerie echoes of her nightmare still lingered in her mind. She had been trapped in a strange village, running frantically through narrow, dusty streets. Behind her, a wild-eyed man wielding a gleaming cutlass pursued her with terrifying speed. It wasn't the first time. This nightmare had haunted her for the past week. Each time she barely managed to escape, waking up just before the madman could catch her. But tonight was different. This time, he had caught up to her. The cold steel of his blade had slashed across her abdomen, and she had felt the searing pain before waking up. Heart pounding, Miriam reached for the small Bible she always kept beside her bed. With trembling hands, she clutched it close to her chest and dropped to her knees to pray. "God, please protect me," she whispered, her voice shaky with fear. Suddenly, a sharp, unbearable pain shot through her abdomen. A strangled cry escaped her lips as she collapsed onto the cold floor, clutching her stomach. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt. Before, it was as if something inside her was being ripped apart. Her roommate, Lydia, stirred in her bed, woken by Miriam's agonized screams. She scrambled out of bed, rushing to her friend's side. "Miriam, what's wrong?" she cried, kneeling beside her. But Miriam could only writhe on the floor, unable to speak, her face contorted in agony. Panic surged through Lydia as she realized her friend needed immediate medical attention. Without wasting another second, she grabbed her phone, called for help, and then struggled to lift Miriam to her feet. With great effort, she helped her out of the room and into the night, heading straight to the nearest hospital. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a terrifying ordeal that would shake them to their core. Lydia's heart pounded as she half-carried, half-dragged Miriam through the dimly lit streets. Miriam's body was limp, her face pale, and her breathing uneven. She groaned in pain, clutching her abdomen as if something inside her was tearing her apart. By the time they reached the hospital, Miriam was barely conscious. The nurse on duty, a middle-aged woman named Nurse Evelyn, took one look at her and immediately called for assistance. "Get a stretcher. We have an emergency," she shouted. Two male attendants rushed over, gently placing Miriam onto the stretcher and wheeling her towards the emergency ward. Lydia tried to follow, but Nurse Evelyn held her back. "You need to wait outside," she said firmly. "The doctor will update you soon." Lydia nodded hesitantly and watched as her best friend was taken away. Her hands trembled as she whispered a silent prayer, hoping Miriam would be all right. Inside the ward, the medical team worked quickly. They checked Miriam's vitals, stabilized her condition, and administered painkillers to ease her suffering. A few minutes later, the on-call doctor, Dr. Helena, arrived. She was a well-respected physician, known for her calm demeanor even in the most critical cases. Dr. Helena took a deep breath before approaching Miriam's bedside. "Can you hear me?" she asked gently. Miriam weakly opened her eyes and tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "It hurts." "Where is the pain located?" Dr. Helena asked. With great effort, Miriam raised a trembling hand and touched her lower abdomen. The doctor frowned and carefully pressed down on the area. Miriam let out a strangled cry, her body arching in pain. Something was terribly wrong. Dr. Helena exchanged a concerned glance with Nurse Evelyn. "We need to check further. Prepare for an internal examination," she instructed. The nurse nodded and proceeded to gather the necessary tools. Meanwhile, Dr. Helena continued questioning Miriam. "Have you had any unusual symptoms before tonight?" Miriam swallowed hard, struggling to form words. "Pain every night after dream." Dr. Helena's brow furrowed. "A dream? What kind of dream?" "A village, a madman chasing me," Miriam's voice trembled as she spoke. "Every night I run. But tonight, he caught me." A chill ran down Dr. Helena's spine. She had heard many medical cases in her career, but this was something else entirely. Nurse Evelyn, unaware of the growing tension, prepared for the examination. She carefully lifted Miriam's hospital gown and gasped. The sight before her was horrifying. Miriam's lower abdomen was covered in strange dark patches, as though something had been eating away at her flesh. But the worst part was what lay beneath her most sensitive area was infested with tiny, wriggling creatures. And mixed within them was thick, black blood. Nurse Evelyn recoiled, covering her mouth to suppress a scream. She stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of medical instruments. Her hands shook as she clutched the edge of the hospital bed, her breathing ragged. "What is it?" Dr. Helena asked sharply. But Nurse Evelyn couldn't respond. She turned and bolted out of the room, rushing towards the nearest restroom, where she collapsed onto the floor and vomited violently. Back in the ward, Dr. Helena, despite her years of experience, felt an unsettling dread creeping over her. She forced herself to examine Miriam more closely. The tiny creatures seemed to be feeding on the blood. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Something unnatural was happening. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Helena stood up and composed herself. She needed to remain calm. With steady hands, she reached for her phone and dialed a number. "Professor Stanley," she spoke as soon as the call connected. "I need your help. I have a patient with a condition I can't explain. You need to see this." As she ended the call, she turned back to Miriam, who had slipped into unconsciousness. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a medical case. It was something far darker. Dr. Helena took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The sight she had just witnessed disturbed her deeply. Tiny, wriggling creatures' black blood and an agonizing pain that no test could explain. This wasn't a normal medical condition. It felt wrong, as if something unseen was at play. She pulled out a fresh pair of gloves and carefully started cleaning Miriam's wounds. The creatures resisted, clinging to her skin as if they were alive with purpose. Dr. Helena had never seen anything like this in her years of medical practice. She used sterilizing alcohol, but instead of dissolving, the creatures twitched and screeched, barely visible to the naked eye. A shiver ran down her spine. As she continued working, the door to the ward creaked open. Lydia rushed in, her face filled with worry. "Doctor, what's happening? Is she okay?" she pleaded. Dr. Helena hesitated before answering. How could she explain something even she couldn't understand? "She's stable for now," she said carefully. "But there's something unusual about her condition." Lydia swallowed hard. "What do you mean? What's wrong with her?" The doctor's eyes darkened. "I need to ask you something important. Has Miriam had any strange experiences before this? Nightmares? Odd encounters? Anything out of the ordinary?" Lydia's face paled. She took a deep breath, glancing at Miriam before whispering, "She's been having nightmares the same one every night." Dr. Helena's heart skipped a beat. What kind of nightmares? A madman chasing her through a village. Every night, she escapes, but last night, he caught her. Lydia's voice trembled. And that's when the pain started. The room fell silent. Dr. Helena clenched her jaw. This wasn't just a coincidence. There was a pattern, a connection between Miriam's dreams and the agony she was facing in reality. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was Professor Stanley, the medical researcher she had called earlier. "I'm here." His voice came through. "Where's the patient?" Dr. Helena rushed out to meet him. Professor Stanley was an older man with gray-streaked hair and sharp, observant eyes. He was one of the most respected doctors in the field, but he was also a man of deep curiosity, someone who believed that not all medical mysteries had scientific answers. She led him into the ward, and as soon as he saw Miriam's condition, his expression hardened. "This is not a medical issue," he muttered under his breath. Dr. Helena frowned. "Then what is it?" Professor Stanley turned to Lydia. "You said she's been having nightmares. Tell me, did anything unusual happen before they started? A strange person she met? A place she visited? Something given to her?" Lydia hesitated, then her eyes widened in realization. She was with someone. A man named Cairo. Professor Stanley's gaze sharpened. "Tell me everything about him." Lydia took a deep breath and began explaining. Lydia's fingers trembled as she recalled the past few weeks. She had dismissed so many things as coincidences, but now she wasn't so sure. "Miriam met Cairo about 2 months ago. Lydia began. He was charming, wealthy, and persistent. He kept trying to win her over, buying her gifts, sending her flowers, showing up unexpectedly at her workplace. She wasn't interested at first. She was already in a serious relationship, but he wouldn't give up. Professor Stanley listened intently, his sharp eyes never leaving Lydia's face. Did she ever agree to be with him? Lydia nodded hesitantly. Not in the way he wanted, but she needed help. Dr. Helena frowned. Help with what? Lydia took a shaky breath. Her father was sick. He needed surgery, and Miriam didn't have enough money. Cairo, he offered to help. But there was a condition: he wanted to spend the night with her. Dr. Helena's stomach twisted. She had heard similar stories before, but something about this one felt even more sinister. She didn't accept at first, Lydia continued. She was furious. But then the hospital bill was due, and her boyfriend couldn't help. Her boss refused to give her an advance. She felt trapped. Professor Stanley sighed, and she went to him. Lydia lowered her gaze, guilt evident on her face. I convinced her. She admitted in a whisper. I told her it was just one night, that she could walk away afterward with the money she needed. I never thought it would lead to this. Dr. Helena exhaled sharply. Tell me about that night. Every detail you can remember. Lydia bit her lip. She met Cairo at a hotel. She told me afterward that he was polite, even gentle. But something about the room felt off. She said it smelled like burning herbs, and the bed had a strange red cloth draped over it. Professor Stanley's eyes darkened. A red cloth? Lydia nodded. She didn't think much of it at the time. She just wanted to get it over with. Afterward, she went to clean herself, but there was no running water in the bathroom. Cairo handed her a white linen cloth instead. Dr. Helena's blood ran cold. A white linen cloth. Professor Stanley repeated, his voice grave. Yes, Lydia whispered. She used it, then left it in the room. Silence filled the ward. Professor Stanley turned to Dr. Helena. We need to speak in private. The two doctors stepped outside, leaving Lydia by Miriam's bedside. As soon as the door closed, Professor Stanley's expression turned serious. This is no ordinary illness, Helena, he said in a low voice. What you're dealing with is a ritual curse. Dr. Helena's throat went dry. Are you telling me that Cairo used Miriam for some kind of... A blood ritual, Professor Stanley confirmed. The red cloth, the white linen, the sudden wealth. I've seen cases like this before. Men who make dark deals to acquire riches, sacrificing innocent women in the process. Dr. Helena shook her head, trying to process everything. But she's still alive. Not for long, Professor Stanley said grimly. If the ritual was incomplete, it means the entity still needs to finish what was started. That explains the nightmares. The madman chasing her? That's Cairo, or rather, the force that he used to take her life. Dr. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. Is there a way to stop it? She asked. Professor Stanley hesitated. Not through medicine, he admitted. This isn't an infection or a disease. It's something else entirely. If you want to save her, you'll need help from someone who understands these things. Dr. Helena didn't believe in the supernatural. She had always trusted science. But now, as she thought about the writhing creatures in Miriam's body, the black blood, the nightmares, she knew science alone wouldn't be enough. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Pastor Gideon, she said when the call was answered. I need your help. Dr. Helena hung up the phone and turned to Professor Stanley. Pastor Gideon is on his way, she said, trying to steady her voice. Professor Stanley nodded. Good. But we don't have much time. The longer she stays in this state, the weaker she gets. Inside the ward, Miriam stirred. Her breathing was shallow and her skin had taken on a ghastly pale hue. Lydia clutched her hand, whispering prayers under her breath, guilt and fear written all over her face. Then, the room's temperature dropped. The fluorescent lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. Lydia's breath hitched. And then Miriam screamed. Her body arched unnaturally, her eyes snapping open completely black, devoid of pupils. Her fingers clawed at the sheets as she let out a guttural growl, a sound no human throat should be able to produce. Lydia stumbled backward. "Doctor, something's wrong." Dr. Helena and Professor Stanley rushed inside just as Miriam's body convulsed violently. The heart monitor beeped erratically, the lines on the screen jumping in wild, unnatural patterns. "Miriam!" Dr. Helena shouted, grabbing her wrist, but the moment she touched her, a force sent her flying across the room. She crashed against the metal cabinet, knocking over a tray of surgical instruments. The room was in chaos. Papers swirled in the air, the windows rattled as if caught in a storm. The machines flickered on and off, their alarms blaring. And then they appeared. Two shadowy figures materialized at the foot of Miriam's bed, a man and a woman, draped in flowing red robes, their faces gaunt, eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. Their mouths twisted into sinister smiles. "She belongs to us," the woman hissed. "She was promised," the man added, his voice echoing unnaturally. Lydia let out a choked sob. "No. Please, leave her alone." The man's gaze snapped to Lydia, his lips curling in amusement. "You brought her to him. You delivered the offering. This is your doing." Lydia's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, shaking. Just then, the door burst open. Pastor Gideon stepped in, his presence commanding, a large Bible clutched in his hands. Two other prayer warriors followed behind him, their faces set in fierce determination. The moment he entered, the entities hissed and recoiled slightly. The lights flickered again, but this time they stabilized. "In the name of Jesus Christ," Pastor Gideon thundered, "I command you to leave this child of God." The figures screamed, their voices shrill, piercing the air like nails on glass. The entire hospital seemed to tremble. Miriam let out a strangled cry, her body contorting, the dark veins on her skin pulsing unnaturally. Pastor Gideon stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "You have no claim over her. She was redeemed by the blood of Christ." The shadows twisted violently, their forms flickering like a dying fire. She was promised. The woman shrieked. The deal was sealed. "The deal is broken," Pastor Gideon declared. He opened his bottle of anointing oil and splashed it toward the figures. The moment the oil touched them, they screamed in agony, their forms burning away like paper in a flame. The hospital shook. Windows shattered, and the wind howled through the room. Miriam's body convulsed one last time, and then silence. The air cleared. The shadows were gone. The unnatural chill in the room lifted. Miriam collapsed onto the bed, her breathing ragged but normal. The dark veins on her skin faded, her complexion returning to its natural color. Her fingers twitched, and then her eyes fluttered open. This time, they were normal. Tears slipped down Lydia's cheeks. "Miriam?" Miriam blinked, her lips parting. "Lydia?" Her voice was hoarse but alive. Dr. Helena, still stunned by what had just happened, stepped forward and checked Miriam's vitals. Her heart rate was stable. Her body temperature was normal. Whatever had plagued her before was gone. Pastor Gideon closed his Bible and looked at Miriam. "You have been freed," he said gently. "But you must never go back to him." Miriam nodded weakly. She knew what he meant. 2 days later, Miriam was discharged from the hospital. She and Lydia walked home together, but their friendship would never be the same. Trust, once broken, is never fully mended. As they turned a corner, they heard a commotion. A crowd had gathered around someone on the street. When they got closer, they froze. It was Cairo. The once dignified, charming businessman was now a madman, shirtless and barefoot, his hair wild and matted with dirt. His expensive car was parked nearby, abandoned. He was eating garbage, muttering nonsense to himself. His wealth had disappeared overnight. His mind had shattered. Justice had been served. Miriam clutched her cross necklace and whispered a silent prayer. Some deals may bring riches, but they always come with a cost.